Hello all. I want to welcome you to the TB Care 2 webinar series on infection prevention and control. Today we have Dr. Ed Nardell, who's one of the, what should I say, premier leaders when it comes to IPC, particularly related to upper room GUV disinfection. So I welcome him to give us an overview of the issues and the challenges in getting UVGI implemented in countries. So Ed, welcome.
Thank you, Niraj, and thanks for arranging this. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending. If you're in the part of the world that celebrates holidays around this time, happy holidays. If not, we're going ahead anyway. I was asked to talk about environmental controls today, particularly germicidal UV, air disinfection. And I think I'm going to make you aware of some growing indications for this technology that really can't be fulfilled by most any other technology that's out there. And as I discuss this, I don't have a lot of slides, about 20 or so. I would urge you to think about questions you might have about how you might actually do this, if you agree by the end of the talk that this is something that's important to do. So with that, let me move ahead and get into presentation mode here. There we go. All right. So the issue that I want to call to your attention that is new, it's not a new issue, but it's new in terms of the realization of what it will mean for TB transmission, and that's global warming. So as many of you know, in many parts of the world, probably all parts of the world really, temperatures are rising. I mean, even in the Arctic and Antarctic, icebergs are melting. And in the warmer parts of the world, temperatures are reaching record highs. That has resulted in a surge in use of air conditioning. Nowhere more so, for example, than in India, but also true in other warm places in the world, certainly Southeast Asia generally, but also South Africa, Southern Africa, I should say, etc. And the kind of air conditioning that's used, although it's not that important, because the use of air conditioning has the same effect on indoor transmission, regardless of the type. But the the type that is being used is illustrated here. If you can see my pointer, I'm pointing to what's called a ductless air conditioning system or split system. What that means is, and many of you around the world are quite familiar with this, there's a unit on the wall that warm air goes in and cool air comes out, and water is extracted, and that water is pumped outside. But the actual condenser, where the heat exchange occurs, is outside. This is very convenient because you don't have that bulky machine inside, but also you don't hear the noise of the air conditioner, etc. But you can see there's no actual exchange of air between the indoor room and the outside. All the air is just recirculated through the device. No exchange occurs. The windows are closed because if you're going to air condition, you have to keep the outside air out, or these machines are become very inefficient. So the change that I'm calling to your attention is that with global warming, windows are being closed. In much of the world, open windows are the main way that air disinfection occurs, that we prevent transmission of tuberculosis and other airborne infections, including measles and influenza. Now, in terms of air conditioning sales, this is a chart from India from 2010 to 2015. Now, there's another 5 years we could have charted here, and I can assure you this has been nothing but go up. And if we look at typical air conditioners, which are in green, and room air conditioners. So the split air conditioners are the ones in red, and the room air condensers or conditioners are in green. They're going up, but not as steeply as these ductless air conditioners like this one over here. Now, this is a global problem, and an article by Davis and Gertler is not about tuberculosis. It's about the annual cooling degree days that are needed. So this is actually projecting the amount of cooling that will be required around the world, and it lists it by country, by population, and by relative wealth, the annual GDP per capita. And then I've added the incidence rate of tuberculosis to this chart from the article. This column wasn't in the original article, but I put it here. So you can see that in terms of annual cooling degree days, that's the numbers of days that are so excessively hot that air conditioning will be required. Not surprisingly, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Brazil, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand are all high on this list. Other countries, Mexico, China, and even the United States are on this list, but you can see there are big differences with these South Asian countries leading the way, African countries not far behind. If you look at the populations of those countries, you see, how many people are impacted, and you look at this column, you see, well, how many of them are in a position to perhaps go and buy an air conditioner, either for the home, but more importantly, I would say right now, this is sales of air conditioning in public places like hospitals and clinics. Doctors are used to having comfort at home usually, and they're insisting on being comfortable at work as well. Now you may say, well, my hospital doesn't have air conditioning, and that in some ways is good, in some ways is bad. Obviously, we want heat can be dangerous to sick people, and air conditioning can really solve that problem. But it's at the cost of, a lot of money, also a lot of power, generating pollution, but it's also resulting in closed windows. Now, in this last column, I've listed the tuberculosis incidence in these countries from 2017 per 100,000. And it's no surprise to any of you that, as we know, India has, because of its huge population and high rates, the most TB cases in the world. China has a huge population and lower rates, but still contributes heavily to the global burden of tuberculosis. Indonesia, and so and so and so. Down the list here, you see that many of the countries which are being forced, if you will, to close their windows are also places where tuberculosis is very common. Now, the other reason that windows are being closed is air pollution. Recently in New Delhi, record air pollution was experienced. People were staying inside because the air outside was so toxic. I've been in China, in Beijing, on some of the worst air pollution days. Happens there as well, and it's increasingly happening around the world. That's another reason why windows are being closed. And in places that depend on windows for cooling as well, again, that's another reason for air conditioning. Now, again, I'm not against air conditioning. I think it's terribly important, but I think I may be the first person to call this problem to the attention of the world that, when we close these windows, we're going to create conditions that are really optimal for airborne transmission, and I'll show you how that works. So one way to look at the risk of transmission of an airborne infection indoors is what we call rebreathed air fraction. How much of the air you breathe was breathed by somebody else? Now, the way that that's kept low is by keeping the windows open so that new air replaces the old air, and you're not breathing the air that somebody else has just breathed before. So what we did in an office in South Africa, just to illustrate this point, this was a doctor's academic office, and we asked 5 of the staff to come in and sit in the room for a couple of hours with the window open, one window, and with an air conditioner off initially. And then we closed the window, turned the air conditioning on, and we mixed the air in the room in both cases and we took CO2 measurements, carbon dioxide measurements, right in the middle of the room. And there were 5 people in the room. The window was open. Then we closed the window and allowed CO2 to equilibrate, and then, close the window and turn the air conditioning on. So here you see the first hour with people in the room, but the window open, and the carbon dioxide level goes from outside levels, which are about 400 or 500, to about 600, 700, 800, which is not unusual in an occupied building, below 1,000. Then we open the window again, and we allow the room is evacuated, the window is open, and the CO2 levels go back to where they started. Then we close the window and turn on the air conditioner, and you see that within an hour, the rates of CO2 climb is quite steep, reaching levels that are approximately double, more than double. And if we waited another hour, I think every indication is that they would go higher yet, perhaps equilibrating in a few hours to 4 or 5 times higher. What does that mean? That actually means when the CO2 level doubles and the ventilation level is half, that the risk of airborne infection is 2 times. And if you double it again, it goes up another 2 times. So basically, we're rebreathing the same air, and the risk, if there is a person with tuberculosis in the room, is quite high as you close the windows. Now, this is not entirely new, because in cold parts of the world, like Russia, in Northern Europe, in the wintertime, especially where buildings are heated by radiators, where there is no outside air brought in, and in fact the windows are tightly sealed. Under those conditions, it's exactly the same. People are breathing the same air, and this has been going on for a very long time, and it may be one of the reasons that we have what I call hypertransmission of tuberculosis in Eastern Europe. You may know that the highest rates of multi-drug resistance tuberculosis in the world are in Russia and in former Soviet Union countries. There's many reasons for that, but among them are the ease of transmission in indoor congregate settings, and perhaps also in homes where windows are closed tight because of the cold, and now in warm places the same thing is happening. Now, I've written this up, that little demonstration, into an article called Cool But Dangerous: How Climate Change is Increasing the Risk of Airborne Infections, and this will be published in the journal Indoor Air in March, and you'll see this in print. So again, the journal is Indoor Air, and it's a commentary with that experiment that I just showed you. Again, that we didn't need to do that experiment. Any engineer could tell you that as you reduce the ventilation by half, the risk will go up by twice. If you reduce it by ventilation by half again, which is at least what happens when you close the windows, you increase the risk again by 2 times. So you can go to 4 or 5 times the risk without any difficulty. Well, what happens when you can't air condition, when you can't open the windows? You need to disinfect that air some other way. And that's where there's a increasing urgency to implement germicidal UV in places where natural ventilation cannot be used. That may be in Eastern Europe because of cold outside, and it may be increasingly in warm climates because of the use of ductless or even ducted air conditioning. So natural ventilation is essential, but it has its limits. It's perfect for outdoor waiting areas where that's possible, but in cold climates and in very hot climates, in air-conditioned environments or in rooms that are heated by air conditioning, then you really need an alternative method. And I'll try to show that there's really only two alternatives to natural ventilation. One is germicidal ultraviolet, which I'll talk about in detail, and the other are room air cleaners. And so I think that germicidal ultraviolet could be the ideal complement to natural ventilation or replacement for natural ventilation when we can't have it. But it has its limitations, and there have been barriers to its implementation, and there are issues around sustainability, which we'll discuss. So here are the alternatives. This is a typical room air cleaner. It's a device that can vary in size. Some of them are small and don't move very much air. Others of them are larger. They can take all different kinds of shapes. And the idea is to bring in air either at the top or from the side, filter that air or irradiate that air and send it back into the room, which removing out pollutants and also airborne contaminants like viruses and bacteria. Now, a lot of manufacturers will tell you that these machines work, and they do, to the extent that if you put contaminated air in here, what comes out of here is going to be germ-free. What they don't tell you is how much air goes through this device and what that means in terms of room air changes in the room you have it. Very often, these devices are limited by flow, so that the number of air changes that they can produce is rather limited. And I'll go into this in more detail in a moment. This is an upper room germicidal UV fixture, and you see the blue light that is coming through these veins or louvers, and this bulb is being reflected off a back reflector, and pretty much only the reflected light is coming through these louvers in a rather straight way. And the purpose of the louvers is to keep the light above people's heads and disinfect the air across the room without getting into the lower room where it can cause eye irritation. So to reiterate, for air disinfection, we have natural ventilation, great when we can use it, but it disappears at night when we close the windows if it's cold. It disappears if we turn on an air conditioner and close the windows, and there's no natural ventilation essentially in buildings that in cold climates where the building is heated by radiators. If a building is heated by a HVAC system, and that HVAC system is working properly, it may bring in some outside air, but usually not very much, because that outside air has to be heated or cooled. So the mechanical ventilation is another option in places in the world that have mechanical ventilation, but it's expensive and it must be maintained. Room air cleaners I've mentioned, and finally upper room germicidal UV air disinfection. We'll talk about that. Now, this little diagram, if you will, is to compare a room air cleaner versus upper room germicidal UV. I was giving a similar talk in Pretoria, South Africa in July 2016, and there was a company there representing a device, an air cleaner, and we asked the salesperson for the specifications. So it's a room air cleaner, and it said that it produced 60 cubic feet per minute, or 28.3 liters per second, clean air delivery rate. Clean air delivery rate. That's how much air is going to come out of that device when it's set on high, making a fair amount of noise, but doing as best it can to treat the air in the room. In a room that's only 4 meters by 4 meters, by 3 meters high, so not a very big room, perhaps an office, that would produce only 2 air changes per hour. That is, the volume of the air in the room going through that device at this rate would produce 2 complete air changes per hour. That's not very much. That's pretty much what natural ventilation, or rather what infiltration does if the windows are closed. So it's better than nothing. And that assumes that there's no short circuiting, because one of the problems with these devices, I'll go back to this for a minute, is that some of the air that's just been filtered ends up coming back into the device again and gets refiltered, not adding to the cleaning of the air, but reducing the overall efficiency. So at best, this is producing 2 air changes. I'll show you that in a similar room with 1 UV fixture and a paddle fan, we can produce the equivalent of 20 air changes per hour, so equivalent to about 10 times that, and we have done the experiments to prove that. So the idea with upper room germicidal UV is to irradiate the entire upper room of a room, and that's a rather large area and large volume. All of the air that makes its way to the upper room from body heat, or ideally with a ceiling mounted paddle fan, the kind that you use routinely all over the world, that air mixes through that upper room, gets disinfected over and over again, and that produces very high rates of air disinfection and is quite safe for people in the lower room. I'll show you that. So here is a comparison done in Russia by Grigory Volchenkov, who is the head doctor at the Oblast of Vladimir TB dispensary, and Paul Jensen from the CDC, who many of you will know from his work in TB infection control. And what they did is set up an experimental room in a hospital in Vladimir, cold climate, and compared mechanical ventilation, upper room germicidal UV, and 3 different air cleaners. One of them, which was used in the Russian space satellite, the manned space satellite, and this is a device used to keep that air clean. So it was rather expensive. And here's the operating cost per year per equivalent air change produced. And you can see that if we consider ventilation sort of the norm, that this fancy air cleaner was more expensive, more than twice as expensive, and 2 other air cleaners were about the same. But upper room germicidal was much, much cheaper to operate, to install and operate. If you look at that as the relative efficiency of producing an air change per hour, germicidal UV was over 9 times more effective, cost effective than ventilation or 3 air cleaners. Now, nothing beats natural ventilation, but this is assuming that you can't use mechanical ventilation, outdoor ventilation, because the windows are closed at night, it's cold, or in fact it's too hot and you're putting in air conditioning. So this is a very important comparison done using 2 different test bacteria and mechanical air sampling to determine how effective these various ways are and how cost effective they are to do this. Now, apologies for this busy slide. I'll just go down. But what have been the barriers to using germicidal UV? Well, one of them has been acceptance. The very notion that of putting up a fixture that puts out germicidal, people aren't familiar with it. They are maybe afraid of it, or certainly don't understand how to do it. I'll show you the results of 2 hospital studies that tell you how effective it is. Also, if you do go through and figure out how to do this and get it installed, it's difficult to show that it's actually working. If the hospital administrator says, well, show me that it's working, you can say, well, it's on, but I can't show you very easily that it's killing bacteria. You have to And that's true also of ventilation. You can't really demonstrate that. You can demonstrate that ventilation is working, but you can't demonstrate the air disinfection very easily. So there is a fear factor. People are afraid of irradiation, even though this is a very safe form of radiation. It's much safer than the radiation in sunlight outside, even though they're both ultraviolet. Outside sunlight is longer wave sunlight, UVA and B, which is much more penetrating. It goes through the skin, it goes through the cornea, it can cause cataracts, and it can cause a skin cancer. That's outdoor, longer wavelength UV. Shorter wavelength UV that's used for air disinfection is more biologically active, and as a result, it actually doesn't get through the skin. It interacts with the skin, dead layer of skin, and doesn't get to the living layer of cells. So it turns out to be safer than than outside UV. And it doesn't cause very much skin irritation. It can cause eye irritation if you look directly into it. You're not supposed to, of course, and that's why the fixtures are designed as they are, with these louvers to keep the UV out of the lower room. Now, we have dosing guidelines, which I'll mention, based on experiments, and those are quite good. You either need to develop some expertise yourself, or you need to hire somebody who knows how to do this. Increasingly, we've trained a lot of people in courses around the world and in Boston to know how to do this. It's not rocket science. It's fairly easy to do, but you need to know what fixtures to buy, how many to buy for a given space, how to install them properly, and how to maintain them. And most hospitals don't have that expertise, and so you either have to find a consultant, or sometimes a company, if it's a reliable and trustworthy company, can do it for you. Increasingly, we'd like to see independent companies who will provide this kind of maintenance, and I'll explain how we propose to do this in India. So you need expertise. You need the fixtures, and I'm happy to tell you that so far some of the better fixtures have been made in the US and in Europe, and very few made elsewhere in the world. There have been some fixtures made in China that were not very good, and there's some fixtures being made in South Africa which have gotten a lot better recently. One of the big US companies, it's not a big company, it's a small company, but one of the major suppliers of UV fixtures is now preparing to make them in India to get around the tariff problem that our government has gotten us involved in. So good quality fixtures will be made in India. They are made in South Africa, which can supply anywhere in Africa. They're made in Europe as well. Russia makes some as well, probably not very much exported. Sorry, keep hitting the button. You do need electricity. These don't require a lot of electricity. They're essentially fluorescent lamps, which are relatively low in terms of power, but they do require power. And if the power goes off during the day, the air disinfection will go off. You also need power to run the fan. So you do need to have reliable, affordable electricity to do this. Obviously, opening windows is cheaper. Now, air conditioning requires a lot more power. So if you have enough power for air conditioning, and if that's the reason you need germicidal UV, this isn't going to add a lot more to that. You need air mixing, so that's the easiest thing to do with low velocity, inexpensive paddle fans. You need some capital to put these in. We've suggested a model where you could lease these, but as far as I know, that's not available at the moment anywhere. And then you need to maintain them. And again, we're hoping that some outside companies will provide these services. If not, there is a maintenance manual that has been produced by the Stop TB initiative. It's available right now in Spanish, Russian, and English. And that is available through the Stop TB initiative on how to maintain these fixtures. So this is the original paper that we published back in 2016, I think. I don't see the actual reference here. I apologize for that. We can get it through to you through URC. That reference should be on this slide, and I don't see it. Of this paper, it was in the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine. A whole bunch of authors. The first author, South African, Matsi Mfuleli, because the study was done in South Africa in a special hospital where highly drug-resistant TB patients expose guinea pigs. Guinea pigs are these small rodent-like animals which are highly susceptible to tuberculosis. And so patients in the ward, all of the air is delivered to these cages containing guinea pigs. And then we turn the UV on every other day. And on the days when the UV is on, one cage of guinea pigs is exposed. And on the days when the UV is off, another exposure chamber receives the air. And the difference between the infection rate of the animals receiving irradiated air from the rooms with irradiated air and the days when the UV is off and the guinea pigs receive unirradiated, untreated air is how effective the UV is. So the question is, on the days when the UV is on, is the air much less infectious than on the days when it's off? And the answer is right here. We found, and we can show you the actual data, that on the days when the UV was on, there was 80% less transmission to the guinea pigs, equivalent of adding 24 air changes an hour to these rooms, much, much, much more than can be produced by an air cleaner device, certainly in the same realm and than outdoor air can do with natural ventilation on a good day with the windows open. If you close the windows, obviously natural ventilation doesn't work. Dosing criteria, there have been many dosing criteria over the years produced by NIOSH, and here we came up with a way of doing it that's based on the volume of the room. And I'm going to tell you that it's probably a little less than this. We were originally using 17 milliwatts per cubic meter of room volume. We think that 12 is adequate. We repeated the study that we published and got even better results that suggested we needed less UV than we thought. So here's how it works. And here we have another hypothetical room, 3 meters tall, 10 meters long, 5 meters. We calculate the volume of that room, which is 150 cubic meters. That's some small ward. 10 meters would be wide enough to have a couple of beds, and typical 3 meter height ceiling, and 5 meters long, long enough for a bed. If we put 17 milliwatts per cubic meter, we would need 2.5 watts. If we put 12, we would need less than that. We need to know how much UV is coming out of a fixture. One of our best fixtures puts out a half of a watt. So that would require 2.5 watts, would require 5 fixtures, usually on the walls that allow for the longest ray length. Now, if we use 12 milliwatts per cubic meter, which is what we are currently recommending, we'd only need the 4 fixtures instead of 5. But that's how we decide how much to use. They put up on the wall above people's heads and maintained. Now, I mentioned that UV is quite safe. We try to keep it above the heads of people in the room, but some does bounce off the ceilings and off the walls. And there is a threshold limit value produced by a safety organization in the United States called the ACGIH, which says that you can't have more than 6 millijoules per cubic centimeter exposure over an 8-hour period, over an 8-hour workday. That turns out to be quite a reliable fixture. It turns out that very few people receive anything near that because, particularly their eyes, because they're walking around, they're not looking at the fixture if the fixtures are properly installed. The only time we get into problems with eye irritation are when the fixtures are installed upside down, or someone climbs up a ladder and looks directly into one of these fixtures and gets eye irritation. But otherwise, quite safe. Now, we've published data on safety. Here's a whole bunch of patients in rooms and nurses working on the ward and in a homeless shelter and in a school. And we've measured how much UV exposure individuals have had of that threshold limit value. And the highest we found was 1/3 of the threshold limit value. That is still for a patient in a room with actually a fairly poorly designed fixture that was putting out more UV in the lower room than necessary, but still only 1/3 of the acceptable permissible dose was received. So these are quite safe. Now, fixtures vary considerably in their construction, and for a long time we've been recommended these louvered fixtures. Unfortunately, they're quite inefficient. They don't put out very much UV, but they work quite well, but they're quite inefficient. Some fixtures are more efficient than others. The ones pictured here produce very little UV, and these with a better design put out, virtually 10 times more UV. So the important thing is to know how much UV comes out of the fixture. If a salesperson tells you how much UV, how much electricity goes into the fixture, that doesn't tell you how much comes out. So you don't want to know what the wattage of the lamp is. You want to know how many watts of UV come out of that fixture. And we're insisting that manufacturers tell you that. Now, the way they know that is to put the fixture in a device like this, where they close this sphere and measure how much UV comes out. It's called an integrating sphere. It's used in the lighting industry, and that's one way to measure how much UV comes out of a fixture. You don't do that. The company does that and tells you how much is coming out. Another way is to put the fixture on a large device that rotates around a meter, and the meter measures how much UV is coming out from every possible angle. Now, the last slide I think I have shows you the next generation, perhaps, of germicidal UV. And this is employing the first LED UV diodes. These LEDs, as you know, are the current way that light is made in flashlights and increasingly in car headlights, in lights in rooms. Sometimes they'll look like a conventional bulb, but the inside are these light emitting diodes, LEDs. They are, initially they're expensive to produce, but as a technology goes on, they get cheaper and cheaper. They last a long time. They draw very little electricity. They use direct current and therefore can run off a battery or off of solar power. And so we've had a couple of prototype UV fixtures made with LED UV devices, which are being produced by a number of different companies. Right now, they're still very expensive, and the power is increasing every year. And they're being used for a variety of applications, really not practically yet for upper room germicidal, but they're being used for water disinfection and for inside of devices that require ultraviolet. So we are just testing these right now in South Africa to show that they work, as well as the fluorescent type UV lamps that are currently available. But eventually, the beauty here is that you can have a UV fixture that might run off of solar power, taking advantage of all that heat generating sunlight, and or also run off a battery if the power goes out, but they're not available yet. In terms of sustainability, and this is the last slide, I realize that there was this one more. This was a proposal for a project in India that did not get funded, but the idea is a good one to talk about. So, if a healthcare facility wants to put in upper room germicidal, we had a plan that a international service company that does a lot of service in hospitals, Service Master, would learn to dose and install upper room germicidal UV fixtures and then come back and maintain them. They would buy them from a manufacturer, or you would buy them from the manufacturer. They would put them in and maintain them. So you wouldn't expect your hospital to have that expertise. Service Master, which is in a lot of hospitals in different parts of the world, including India, would come in periodically to dust the fixtures and to make sure that the lamps are working. If you don't do that, what happens is you come back a year later after you've installed these fixtures and you'll find that they're full of bugs, or that lamps have burned out, or they're terribly dusty, and they're no longer really doing what they're supposed to do. Now, again, you can have your hospital maintenance do this, but the reality is you train somebody and then they move on to a different job, and the person who comes in doesn't know how to do it, and they're afraid, or somebody gets an eye burn. So this team that would come in and do it periodically for hopefully a reasonable fee would have the expertise to plan, install, and maintain upper room germicidal UV. If that doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist very many places at the moment, you can still put in germicidal UV, but you really must pay attention to the really simple steps that are needed to maintain them. Dr. Volchenkov in Vladimir has had a UV system working for probably a decade. And I can tell you that in addition to a proper respirator program and other attention to early diagnosis of drug resistance, et cetera, that the infection rate of staff has gone from very high rates to zero in Vladimir. So these can work, but they need to be maintained. And I think with that, I will stop the slides and be happy in the last 15 minutes, or how much time is required, to take your questions. I'm just going to back up to a slide that might be worth keeping on the board while we're talking. So anyone in the audience or in the office at URC have any questions that we can talk about further?
Yes, I think it's very timely. I think our biggest challenge has been in getting the UVGI program implemented. I think still there are a lot of barriers and all that. But I'm going to talk about more current things. Yesterday I was watching news about measles. I'm not sure if you watched it, that in LAX, there were a couple of people who passed through there, and then they went to Denver. So they were all looking for people. And again, measles is spread via, airborne. I mean, it's the virus stage. So the question is, I suddenly saw, I said, there's such a sense of urgency finding worried about all those people who may have come in contact with these three individuals. But with TB, at least in developing countries, maybe not so much in the US, but in developing countries where there is a lot of TB in community, I don't see that sense of urgency. So anyway, the question that I had for you, what do we do to create that sense of urgency? I know you've been there, pushing this concept for a long time. So what do you think we're not doing to create that sense of urgency?
Well, thanks, Niraj. I mean, it is frustrating because we've been sitting on a technology that we know works for more than 70 years. And, we could go back to this list of barriers. And I pretty much have them listed. Happened to that.
Yeah, you just went through that. Yes.
Yeah, there it is.
Mm-hmm.
But, how to make this? So right now, actually, we have a bit of a plan, and it may take off. My thinking was that if we were to get the attention of the Mitsubishis and the Fujitsus of the world, the Carrier the big companies make air conditioning, that if they were to pay attention and to this problem and say, well, yes, they're causing a problem, they're part of a problem, but they can also make money selling the solution. If Mitsubishi and Fujitsu started marketing upper room germicidal UV along with their air conditioning for parts of the world where this is an issue, I think it would be a game changer entirely. We would have major company involved, their marketing ability, etc. It would be, once it became routinely applied, the maintenance would follow, and etc. So I think we suffer from this being right now manufactured by very small companies, mostly in the US, where there's not a huge need for it, and less so in developing countries. It's engineers don't learn about this technology in engineering school, and as a result, it has just been in limbo. But if we can get a big company, now we've been working with, on the LED UV, with a company called Excelitas, which designs fixtures, and they have, because of the measles and the influenza potential, have actually taken an interest in, and they have direct connections with Mitsubishi and some of the other big companies, which I have been unable to approach. And we're hoping that, you know, if we can get to their marketing and developing people, that if one of them gets on board, all of them will want to get on board, and we may see a complete change in the landscape.
Responses. Thanks. We have a couple of hands raised. One is Shahid. Could you please go ahead, ask your question? Can you unmute him? Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Shahid Khokar from Pakistan. My question is regarding the ventilation in the elite hospital. Those are centrally air conditioned. Maybe they are using HV or other gadgets, but what do you suggest? What should they do to deal with the MDR cases?
Well, let's just talk a second about central air conditioning. Usually, as I mentioned, central air conditioning allows you to bring in a certain amount of outdoor air. So there is some air replacement, but it's not very much. And, you know, often if you go, even in the US, you will find that maintenance of, and especially in hospitals, maintenance of mechanical air conditioning is often suboptimal and doesn't work. You know, there's no difference in transmission between drug-resistant and drug-susceptible TB, but the concerns are greater for drug-resistant TB. So in Pakistan, in a hospital that maintains, that is treating MDR TB, the most important thing is to get them on effective treatment based on molecular diagnostics, so you know you're treating them properly, and because that will render them non-infectious. But in terms of environmental controls, upper room germicidal is a good thing to supplement air disinfection with, but you don't want that air recirculating throughout the hospital, especially for newly diagnosed patients. And, you know, we've shown in Russia that it's unsuspected drug resistance contributes to a lot of drug resistant generation. So if you're treating somebody for drug susceptible TB and they're not getting better and only find out a couple of months later that they actually had drug resistant TB, they've been transmitting in the hospital perhaps, and certainly in the community for a couple of months. And so the key thing is to diagnose quickly and get people on effective therapy. Secondarily, in a hospital, you have to have either good outdoor ventilation, good mechanical ventilation, and if you want to supplement that with upper room germicidal UV, that's a good thing. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks. I have next Babatunde Sani, if you have any questions. Can you unmute him?
Yeah, he's unmuted. He just needs to do it from his end.
Okay. Sunny, you need to unmute yourself from your side.
Oh, yes, thanks.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. As you have rightly said, the issue of safety, efficacy, as well as the advantage of GUV is never debated. We know there are some issues around the acceptability. But also, I will quickly ask about your experience when it comes to the communication, because we are talking about acceptability. Could it have been because UVG has not been appropriately, GUV has not been appropriately integrated into the national policies or guidelines in a way that the frontline healthcare workers we understand and demand for its use? Because what we presently observe is that a lot of people, even though we say we have GUV in our facilities, the issue of the air mix is not really emphasized, and there are a lot of misconceptions about the usage of this particular device. Thanks, I will meet.
Where are you from?
URC.
Yes, where is this questioner from? What country?
Sunny. He was in South Africa recently.
From the
okay, South Africa. Okay, so yeah, South Africa is a very special case because it's been, you know, when if you remember, in 2006 is when the publication of the Tugela Ferry outbreak of XDR-TB was described. And following that, there was a great concern in South Africa about the spread of highly drug-resistant tuberculosis in hospitals. And so everybody and anybody was producing something that looked like germicidal UV fixtures and selling them. And the government bought a lot of them and put them up in hospitals. Many of them were not well designed for safety or efficacy. People got eye and skin irritation, and the whole thing went down the tubes very quickly. And as you know, right now there's been a moratorium on using government money to buy germicidal UV. We'd like to see that moratorium lifted, but I think there's a lot of politics involved because, as you say, you know, I think workers and patients have a right to ask for reasonable environmental controls, and then who pays for them? And I think the government, being strapped as it is concerned about opening those floodgates. So I have a feeling that there's an economic barrier to the greater acceptability. Now, in South Africa, there are very good guidelines that CSIR has developed with our help. We agree with them entirely. Maintenance fixtures are being produced that are good quality. Some of the companies will actually do the maintenance. So the barriers are less in South Africa, I would say, to actually doing it. But if you're a government facility, right now you can't spend government money on it. So that's a real barrier. I don't know if there's any other issues that I didn't touch on.
Yeah.
There's one more.
Yeah, go ahead. So I think we have another, Fernando, please go ahead. You'll have to unmute from your side.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Dr. Ed, this is Fernando Santos from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Hi, Fernando.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
It's a nice presentation. I would like to make an observation. It's
Sure.
one doubt we have here. In Brazil, we don't have this technology regarding programmatic inside hospitals or other facilities beyond the labs. The labs usually to use this technology, but how to bring some evidence beyond the fear of acceptance if there is not any issue or topic in our guidelines, national guideline. So my My question is, which is the better way to bring this technology in nowadays, in routine, just mention in national guidelines, or first mention in the national guidelines, we should make a pilot study, or just bring international experience?
Right.
How do you face these steps?
Quickly, because I know we're running out of time. You know, Paul Jensen has done a pilot study in Brazil, and loves to tell the story of the gradual acceptance. There was fear in the beginning, and then people began to accept that this was perfectly safe. It is in the WHO guidelines now in a much more favorable way. You know, the WHO guidelines are quite evidence-based, and ironically, among all the things that you can do for preventing TB transmission, many of them are not evidence-based. UV is. So we have the studies for UV that we don't have for a lot of the other interventions we already do. So you can, I think if we were in the national guidelines would be great. Additional demonstrations would be great. But you know, you need someone who, like yourself, who maybe is in a position to help influence in a prominent hospital to find a way to fund a demonstration that other people in the country can look to and say, you know, this is not so scary, it is doable, here's where you get fixtures, and that could be done. There are suppliers who have worked in South America and Brazil in particular, and who I'm sure would actually love to build them there as well, or work with companies to build them there.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm participating in the national group to describe and publish next year our first national guideline regarding infection control in tuberculosis. So I bring this issue for the first time.
Good, and I'm sure that Brazil is experiencing high temperatures too, and that natural ventilation is not going to be as reliable in the future as it has been going forward.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. We appreciate everyone's attendance. I think it was a great presentation, and I think Sharanya will be sending the notes.
Yes, the presentation and the webinar recording will be shared via email, and it will be also available on tb.academy. Thank you, Ed, for leading such an informative presentation. If you have any more questions, please feel free to email it in to tbcare@urc-chs.com. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Ed.
Yep.
Bye-bye.